Welcome to the MadTech Podcast special from ExchangeWire, a weekly deep dive into a pressing industry issue.
Hello, and welcome to this very special edition of the MadTech Podcast. We're going to be talking about a bill that has not been covered so much over in the UK, but is actually really important regarding privacy and ad tech in the States. It is the California AB566 bill that was just signed in by Gavin Newsom in California. I want to dissect the bill a little bit, so I am joined by expert Nikki Bhargava from Reed Smith Law Firm. Nikki, welcome.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much for having me. Excited to talk about AB566.
Yeah, no, really pleased to have you on and to get your insights on this. Before we kick off into the bill, tell me a little bit about yourself and your practice.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm Nikki Bhargava. I'm a partner at Reed Smith in the Entertainment Media Group. I work out of Chicago, and I also lead our AI practice as well. So my practice is really focused on exactly this issue, the convergence between advertising and privacy, and how advertisers, brands, the ad tech ecosystem is going to be, has been handling some of the newest privacy developments over the past few years, including this one in AB 566.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. You're in an incredibly interesting space at the moment with entertainment, media, and AI. But let's do some groundwork to start with. Can you give me a bit more detail on the bill itself, how it's come to pass, and some of the key provisions that the bill enlists at the moment?
Yes. So AB566 was just signed by Governor Newsom. At the heart of it, basically, it requires that all consumer web browsers have a simple and frictionless built-in functionality for users to send an opt-out preference signal to websites when the user visits that site using the browser. So the signal opt-out preference signal communicates the consumer's instruction to the website owner not to sell or share the user's personal information. So that's really the big piece of 566. It's actually a very short revision to the California Consumer Privacy Act, but a really big impact. The provision also requires that browser providers make sure that they provide a publicly accessible notice with instructions on how the opt-out signal works and what the effect of the signal is. So it's important to remember that the law isn't going to go into effect until January 1st, 2027. So there is some time for both browser providers, but also businesses who are going to have to receive that signal to figure out how they're going to implement it and get compliant. So there's a little bit of runway, but not necessarily a lot. What this law was really aiming to do, if you look at it from the legislator's point of view and from the regulator's point of view, was to empower consumers and make it easier for consumers to opt out of the sale and sharing of their personal information. At the heart of it, consumers have certain privacy rights, but if they are not sure how to exercise them, or it's difficult to exercise them, then those rights are pretty meaningless when it comes to at least how the regulators think about it. And in particular, the opt-out preference signal has been a really high priority for the California Privacy Protection Agency. The agency has been very active in connection with the opt-out preference signal. Earlier this year, they launched an entire campaign building awareness about the opt-out preference signal through materials and targeted campaigns, trying to clarify the regulations in relation to the opt-out signal. And they've also prioritized enforcement in this area. So just last month, I know we're at the end of October, but in September, California had announced a joint investigation along with Colorado and Connecticut to investigate potential noncompliance with the global privacy control, which is one type of opt-out preference signal. So this law is really in line with what the agency has been saying all year they're focused on.
Yeah, and it's like there's a lot in what you just said there that is really interesting, and the impact it's going to have on ad tech and the wider tech industry as well. I think one point that you made there that it is all right for these kind of for opt-outs to exist and for kind of privacy measures to exist, but they're quite meaningless if the consumer has no idea how to use them, or if they're opaque, and if they are, if they're really not understood widely. So it's really interesting this bill's come in. How do you see the impact on both the ad tech industry, the tech industry in general, and the consumer as well? How do you feel that's going to play out?
Yeah. So, just to kind of level set, right now under the regulations, businesses already had an obligation to recognize opt-out preference signals. The difference that this law makes is that it automates it, right? Every browser provide this functionality built into the browser. And currently, a lot of businesses offer consumers the right to opt out of sale and sharing, but it could be done on a business by business basis. Or you could download an extension. The NAI has provided a GPC browser extension you can add to your browser and then exercise the right that way. And then there's some browsers that already have the signal built in. So the concept of the opt-out preference signal is not new. What I think is going to change with AB566 is the scale of the signal and the opt-out. Right now that it's going to be automated and it's going to be required to be built into every browser, likely the volume of opt-outs of sale and sharing is going to increase significantly. That's really what the industry is thinking is going to happen. And, it's probably a pretty good guess as to how it will play out. So in terms of how does it end up impacting, the advertisers and other entities in the ad tech system, one, I think this will push compliance quite a bit because every business will be required to recognize the opt-out preference signal. And, currently it's global privacy control, but maybe not everybody is using the signal that much right now. And so it's not necessarily that every business is constantly having its technology tested to see if they're really receiving the signal. But I think that there will be a big compliance push because once it's built into every browser, it's really going to have to be something that businesses that are collecting data from consumers in California have to pay attention to. It's also going to have a profound impact on the amount of data that is collected. If we kind of think about just human nature, right? And there are a lot of questions about how exactly this is going to be implemented. But if we think about human nature, if a consumer turns on their signal, they may not turn it off on a business to business basis. They may just go about their business and, a month may go by and they haven't really paid attention to whether they want to turn it off when they go to a website or they want to turn it on. And this is a big concern within the industry as well. But that could impact the volume of data that's being collected. The change in scale of opt-outs of sale and sharing, because sale and sharing is so integral to targeted advertising, behavioral advertising, it could push advertisers towards other forms of advertising that are not necessarily as reliant on that kind of information. We've already seen a push towards contextual advertising lately because of all the regulation. And so it may push them further towards contextual advertising. And it may also, increase the value of first-party data. So we've seen a lot of investment already because of other regulation into the collection of first-party data, which isn't necessarily impacted by browser-based signals.
Really interesting. Do you think this legislation's been hastened by Google's kind of decision not to remove third-party cookies, that they will still remain? Was that kind of a spur on for this legislation to go through? What do you think were Governor Newsom's reasons behind it?
I don't necessarily know if it's tied to the third-party cookie aspect on, a private level, but I do think California has been really ready to lead the pack when it comes to allowing consumers control of their information. And so the opt-out signal has been a priority for, not just this year, not just this legislation, but, since it's come out. So the CPPA has already been, engaging in enforcement actions and sweeps to make sure that there's compliance there. I think there's other laws that have been enacted, which again provide consumers the right to limit the kind of information that they get, particularly for targeted advertising. So data broker laws, which have been strengthened with stronger deletion rights. And in in kind of talking about the law, even Governor Newsom highlighted the fact that what he's interested in is strengthening consumer rights. And so this is just one step. And I think they realize, maybe because way in the past we've sort of had this this concept of do not track signals. I can't even say how old it is, but it's pretty old, but it wasn't built into the technology ever. And so most of the time when you thought of do not track, most sites, most browsers didn't really respond to each other. And I think in looking at how to structure this particular law, they were interested in making sure that the technology and the requirements match together.
Yeah. In terms of that, the kind of, the groundwork that was done for this and the thought behind it, where do you think there is precedent? Where are you looking at results? Are you looking at GDPR to see whether this is a kind of similar, the bill doing the same thing in California? What do you think, the precedent could be?
The precedent for how to implement the opt-outs, or?
Yeah, because I'm just thinking, if you go onto a website in Europe compared to the States, you are given immediately a banner to opt in or opt out of data collection. It's the result of GDPR. It's fundamentally changed the experience of the web for a lot of people. And what you were saying about kind of people turning it off and forgetting now and again, that's become impossible with GDPR. So I'm just wondering if there's a connection there, if it's going to turn the web experience in California into a similar state as Europe.
Well, I know one of the things that the CPPA and legislature is focused on, this concept of frictionless opt-out. And so, one of the things with the banners is that it does create some friction with respect to when you get to a website and the banner comes up and you're trying to figure out, how do I get rid of the banner because I want it to see what was on the site. And so the concept of the signal is really that it's going to happen in the background. And that, again, existed prior to the passage of this law. So it's a concept that's already been in the CCPA regulations, where what regulators are looking for is, again, that it's easy, it's obvious, and it's frictionless, particularly for browser-based signals. And so, it should be, you get to the site, the signal communicates, and then if the signal is opt me out, it opts out immediately without things like pop-ups, without, additional messages. And I think this is where the questions around implementation are really going to come up, because it's brand new right now. And there's some room. AB566 left room for the CPPA to put out regulations. And I think the industry is very much, pushing for quick regulations so that there's actually time to implement it, both on the browser side, but also the business side, and really understand how it works. But, there are a lot of questions about how it's going to get implemented. So, for example, right, the concept of an opt-out preference signal doesn't mean that it's just one signal. There's a concern that there may be a proliferation of different signals. Right now, global privacy control is the accepted signal. I hope, and I think the industry hopes, that everyone's going to coalesce around a single standard, because if there are multiple standards for the opt-out preference signal, it's something that businesses will have to adapt to. A lot of businesses use consent management platforms, so they may be waiting for consent managed platforms to catch up with what those, standards are. And so there's a downstream delay, which again impacts how much time you have to comply. right? But the one good thing is in the regulations, it does state that a valid opt-out preference signal, it is a format that's commonly used and recognized by businesses. So hopefully that means that the industry will converge to, you know, a single signal. So that's the hope. The other issue that comes up in terms of implementation is right now it's not clear if it's going to be a default on or if it's going to be a choice that the consumer has to turn on. Obviously, the businesses will feel a certain way about default on because that starts that train of did the consumer make a conscious decision then to opt out, or are they just downloading the browser and they're starting to use it without really getting to the point of understanding what default on means and what is the impact of not selling or sharing their information. So that's a question that is still waiting to be answered. There are other questions about the fact that this is a California law, and what it really regulates is collection of information from Californians. So what does that mean for the rest of the country, right? Is there to be a configuration that's just for California, or if a browser comes out and I'm in Chicago, so if I download it and it's going to be default on out, even though I'm not sitting in California, again, that has a bigger impact than just necessarily California. So while companies, browser providers outside of California may have to comply with it, businesses that fall under the scope of CCPA have to comply with it. It still only applies to California, to data collected from California residents at the end of the day. So that becomes a fine line. I mean, we've seen every state kind of start to adopt what other states are doing. So I guess that's not something I would dwell too far on, because I think if it's something that looks successful, other states will go ahead and incorporate it. And so it won't be a state-specific issue for that long. There's still a lot of questions out there. There are a number of answers that are currently in the regulations because the opt-out preference signal is not brand new. So the regulations have a lot of details about how it's supposed to be implemented. But I think it gets more complicated, right? If you have, for example, if you're part of a financial incentive, and in order to participate in that financial incentive, it requires sale and sharing of your information. So if your browser signal is set to opt out, the regulations currently say there's a way to make you aware and then, get your affirmation that you really want to opt out. But it just gets more complicated as those signals, again, proliferate.
Yeah, and it's a lot for the consumer and the internet user to kind of, I suppose, as you say, in that kind of particular case, there's a lot for them to consider, a lot of action needed still on the consumer side to ensure their own privacy, which is always, I find fascinating about privacy regulations, how much onus it puts on the individual rather than the company. Do you think there's hope of avoiding this with AB566?
Avoiding consumer confusion around.
Overburdening and confusing the consumer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the point, right? Is that from a regulatory perspective, the assumption is that users do want to keep their information more private. I also think, though, that kind of going back to that notion of consumers aren't used to exercising a choice, site by site by site, especially when it's in the background. At least the banners, it kind of pops up and you see it right away and you have to make a choice. With a signal, it's not going to keep popping up and telling you necessarily that this is the choice you have made, right? It may be, maybe there's an indicator on the website that says that you've, opted out of sale, or maybe there's an indicator in the browser. But that's something consumers are going to have to learn to look at and then learn to appreciate what that means for them, right? What I think a lot of consumers don't know what it means to opt out of sale or sharing. It doesn't mean that you're not going to see ads. You're still going to see ads. It doesn't mean that no one's collecting your information. There are still entities collecting your information. It doesn't mean that there's no analytics. That's still happening. But it is, potentially things that they might find value in. So for example, you're not going to get the ad that's more personalized to you. You're going to get ads that may have no relevance to you, right? Some other things that the industry highlights is, something that we've seen the rise of in the last I say 4 years, but the last few years is the ability for like smaller businesses to target consumers that are probably more interested. So they don't have to spend a ton of money. They're still spending a lot of money, but not as much because they can target specific consumers and, really get a little bit more ROI out of it. So, I mean, that's debatable at the end of the day. That's kind of how the industry, touts the benefits of it. So, but I do think that there's some value for consumers in getting ads for things that they actually care about, as opposed to ads for things that have no relevance to them whatsoever.
Yeah, it's a better experience, and that it's the value exchange that's perhaps not so well understood. But yeah, like you say, if it helps tailor targeting, if it helps make stuff more relevant. You've talked already about contextual targeting, which is again something we're talking a lot over here about. There's lots, to explain to consumers, but it's a really interesting, an interesting development for California. One thing before we wrap up, mobile apps weren't included in this bill. Is that correct? And why? And what might the impact of that be?
Yeah, they weren't expressly included. So this bill was actually passed by legislature last year, and Governor Newsom vetoed it last year. And that bill specifically called out compliance for mobile operating systems. And the commentary there was, at the time that mobile operating systems didn't really have technology in place to operationalize on the requirement. So browsers already had extensions, websites already had ways of recognizing it, but the operating system didn't necessarily have that. And the view from the governor's office was that the law shouldn't be driving, the technology development, right? Design questions have to come first, and then, followed by the law for that requirement. So I think, it's something that we should keep an eye on for sure, especially again, as technology does evolve to allow a similar opt-out experience, and how, once that takes shape, I think that we'll see a natural progression to also include mobile apps in this type of requirement.
Yeah, sort of a kind of a test and learn situation as the bill settles in 2027. Final question for you on this, and I want to know a little bit about the risks of non-compliance here. What do you think the punishments could be? What are the legal consequences for companies that don't comply? And yeah, how does this contrast with previous privacy legislation?
Yeah, so this one's a little bit interesting because it creates a safe harbor for browser providers. So browser providers, if they have built in this functionality and websites don't recognize it, then browser providers are not the ones that are going to be held liable for that non-compliance, which is it's a slightly newer concept within the CCPA. But generally speaking, this amended the CCPA. So theoretically, it takes on the penalties that come with non-compliance for CCPA as well, which is, which is $2,500 per occurrence, right? So it could be per time the signal should have been given and isn't, or per day that, you haven't complied. And it goes up to $7,500 if it's an intentional violation. So, so the penalties can be pretty significant. And we've seen California's agencies, make, go after companies with significant penalties as well, really depending on the type of issue. So I really think the risk is more, again, on the side of the sites, the businesses that have to recognize the signal, because, again, they haven't necessarily prepared for the scale or the volume or the impact of what that's going to do when the signal, becomes live on such a large scale. That's really where I would sort of issue my warning, right, to businesses to look to put in processes to really evaluate what it is that, what sale and sharing is going to do to their business, and follow that flow and really understand how it's going to impact it, and figure out how to mitigate that, right? Different ways that they can mitigate it. And then also audit and test the actual technical implementation. That's where regulators get you every time, because they're going to go and test it. And they've said it time and time again, you should be testing it and auditing it and making sure it works. So particularly when there are larger volumes, is your, implementation capable of handling that as well?
Amazing. Well, yeah, the companies have just over a year to get their compliance in order, to do this testing and get themselves sorted before the bill comes in. Nikki, thank you so much for your time. That was fascinating, a really interesting topic, and great to get your expertise in it. So really appreciate your time today. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks so much, John, for having me. It was fun to talk about it.
No, you're very welcome, and we'll have you back sometime next year as the countdown begins for AB566.
It's really going.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you very much, and thank you all for listening to the MadTech Podcast. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to this MadTech Podcast special. We'll be back to discuss another hot industry topic soon.